What's up, Man Fans? I'm your host, Josh Black, and this is the Man Fans Fantasy Football Podcast. Hit me up on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF and on Facebook at ManFansFootball. And while you're on Facebook, check out our partner, Badass Sports. People are over there winning sports memorabilia every day. Autographed jerseys, helmets, cards, they've got everything you need for your man cave. That's Badass Sports on Facebook, and tell them who sent you. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got a brand new video series over there called Draftkings Fantasy Locks. It's a short video designed to help you guys get started building your lineups, and I'll put a link to our channel in the description box below. NFL Week 4 is here, and Man Fans know what time it is. It's time to get down to business with that Week 4 Draftkings Fantasy Preview. As always, I'm going to give you my top plays for Sunday's main slate. We'll break down every position using DraftKings pricing, Pro Football Focus statistics, and betting lines by Bovada. Let's start under center. All the stud quarterbacks are back on the main slate. Jackson, Wilson, and Mahomes make up the big three up top. And of the three, I think Wilson's the play. But I'm going in a different direction. It's time to dumpster dive. So let's slide way down the board and talk about Cleveland Browns quarterback Baker Mayfield. Cleveland's at Dallas this week and a 4.5-point dog. DraftKings has him priced at $5,800 and projected for 19.4 fantasy points. The last couple weeks, we've seen a conservative game plan from the Browns, and that's led to some pretty pedestrian fantasy numbers for Baker. Cleveland has a dynamic run game, and they like to grind it out with a lead. But I'm not sure how much of a lead they're going to have this week, and that's good news for Mayfield owners. He faces off against a Dallas defense that ranks 31st against opposing quarterbacks. They've been ripped over the last two games, surrendering 588 passing yards and 9 total touchdowns. This Dallas secondary's given up plenty of big plays. A 42-yard touchdown to Hayden Hurst, a 43-yard touchdown to Tyler Lockett, and a 62-yard should-have-been touchdown to DK Metcalf. So I like Baker to drop a couple bombs in this game. He's got some nice pass catchers at his disposal, and the volume's going to be there. This game has a 56-point over-under, and that's the highest on the slate. But there's more. I saved the best for last. Pro Football Focus has Mayfield's ownership projected under 2%, and that makes him my favorite GPP play at quarterback this week. You can lock him in. Miami Dolphins quarterback Ryan Fitzpatrick. He's at home against Seattle, and Miami's a 7-point dog. Fitzpatrick's priced at $5,400 and projected for 19.7 fantasy points. After a rough week 1, Fitzy's been pretty decent. Last week, the beard outdueled the stash. Only 160 passing yards, but 3 total touchdowns and 25 fantasy points. This week, Fitzmagic gets that leaky Seattle defense. They've allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Let's do a quick recap. In week 1, Matt Ryan got him for 27.9 fantasy points. In week 2, Cam Newton got him for 38.6. And in week 3, Dirty Dak and the boys got him for 33.5 fantasy points. Next man up, Ryan Fitzpatrick. It's a recipe for fantasy goodness. Seattle has a dynamic offense, Miami has a terrible defense. Fitzpatrick should have 40-plus pass attempts in this game. Against the Seattle secondary, that's mucho garbo. Plus, Fitzy gives you a nice little rushing floor. He's accrued 68 rushing yards and a touchdown this season. Ryan Fitzpatrick has consistently outperformed his price, and at $5,400, I think he smashes again this week. If you're looking for a cash game quarterback, Fitzmagic's your guy. Other quarterbacks I like this week, Houston Texans Deshaun Watson at home against Minnesota, priced at $6,600, projected for 22 fantasy points, and it's a nice matchup against a Vikings defense that allows the third most yards per game passing. And Detroit Lions Matt Stafford at home against New Orleans, priced at $5,900, projected for 19.3 fantasy points, and he's going to be in for a big day against the Saints defense that ranks 28th against opposing quarterbacks. Moving on. Let's dive into my top running back plays for week 4. Sometimes you got to pay the cost to be the boss, and running back's where I'm spending my money this week. If you want 20 plus fantasy points from a running back, I don't think you need to look any further than New Orleans Saints running back Alvin Kamara. New Orleans is at Detroit and a 4-point favorite. Kamara is priced at $8,000 on DraftKings and projected for 23.4 fantasy points. Kamara's been the Saints' #1 pass catcher with Mike Thomas out. Drew Brees has morphed into check down Charlie, and that's got Kamara averaging 10 targets a game, catching 90% of those passes for over 10 yards per catch. It's unclear if Big Mike's going to suit up this week, but I'd imagine they won't need him. They're up against a Detroit defense that ranks 30th against opposing running backs. The Lions just can't tackle. They average 1.37 yards before contact, which is decent, but they're allowing 172 rushing yards per game, and that's third worst in the NFL. Combine that with Kamara's big play ability, and it's game over for Detroit. I like to see some more rushing volume from Alvin, and I think that happens this Sunday. But worst case scenario, dude hits value on catches and yardage alone. You can lock him in. Minnesota Vikings running back Dalvin Cook. Minnesota's at Houston and a 3.5-point dog. Cook's priced at $7,800 on Draftkings and projected for 17.2 fantasy points. How's this dude still $7,600? Last week, at the same price tag, he ran wild on the Titans. 22 attempts for 181 yards and a score. Dalvin's a beast. He's third in rushing yards, averaging 6.13 yards per carry, and he leads the league with 4 rushing touchdowns. This week, he gets a butter-soft matchup against Houston. They rank 22nd against opposing running backs and allow 188 yards per game on the ground. That's the most in the NFL. I'd like to see Dalvin get more involved in the passing game, though. Last season, he caught 53 balls for 519 yards. So dude's a legitimate threat out of the backfield. But so far this year, he's got a whopping 5 catches. But if he keeps scoring touchdowns every week, the PPR stuff is just icing on the cake. I like him to go for over 100 yards on the ground, a handful of catches, and at least 1 score. He's another cash game staple for me this week. Jacksonville Jaguars running back James Robinson. Jacksonville's at Cincinnati and a 3-point dog. Draftkings has him priced at $6,500 and projected for 15.3 fantasy points. And I've been ringing the bell for this guy since week 1. Once the Jags released Leonard Fournette, I knew how high they were on Robinson. He's become their every down back and currently sits as RB4 in fantasy scoring. This week, he gets that super juicy matchup against Cincinnati. They rank 27th against opposing running backs, allowing 181 rushing yards per game. That's second most in the NFL. Let's do some quick math. The Bengals allow 2.46 yards before contact, and James Robinson averages 3.42 yards after contact. So in theory, that's like 6 yards per carry. Give my dude 20 touches, and we're well on our way. Sprinkle in some catches, maybe even a touchdown, and that's the recipe for fantasy goodness. Robinson has a safe floor with a sky-high ceiling, and he's projected for sub 8% ownership. If you're playing GPPs, you're playing James Robinson. Other running backs worth a look this week. Oakland Raiders' Josh Jacobs is at home against Buffalo, priced at $6,800, projected for 20.4 fantasy points, and I think he's in a nice bounce-back spot against a Buffalo defense that just got ripped by the Rams for 167 rushing yards. And I also like Arizona Cardinals' Kenyon Drake on the road at Carolina, priced at $6,000, projected for 13.8 fantasy points, and I think this could be the week that Drake breaks out. Carolina has allowed 7 rushing touchdowns so far this season. Let's shift gears and talk about my week 4 wide receivers. I'm going to be a value shopper at wide receiver this week. For me, it's a full fade over 6K. In fact, let's start right there. Detroit Lions wide receiver Kenny Golladay. He's at home against New Orleans, and Detroit's a 4.5-point dog. Galladay's priced at $6,000 and projected for 15.8 fantasy points. Golladay looks to be over that hamstring issue that kept him out the first 2 weeks. He debuted against Arizona last week and looked pretty good. He led the Lions in targets, catches, and receiving yards. Plus, he scored a touchdown. This week, he'll see a New Orleans defense that ranks 14th against opposing wide receivers. They've been susceptible to big, athletic pass catchers. Last week, Allen Lazard caught a 72-yard touchdown on a beautifully thrown ball from Aaron Rodgers. In week 2, Darren Waller took him to school for 12 catches, 105 yards, and a touchdown. Golladay should see plenty of coverage from Marshawn Lattimore in this contest, and that's a 60% advantage according to Pro Football Focus. The Lions are expected to trail in this game, not to mention it's the second highest point total on the slate, so Kenny should be in for a big one. And I'll definitely be rostering some Golladay this weekend. Cleveland Browns wide receiver Odell Beckham Jr. Cleveland's at Dallas in a 4.5-point dog. Draftkings has him priced at 5,800 and projected for 14.9 fantasy points. OBJ's got fantasy owners disappointed so far. He hasn't eclipsed 75 receiving yards yet this season, due in large part to Greg Stefanski's run-first offense. But we all know what type of athleticism this dude brings to the table. And this week, Odell gets the super juicy matchup against Dallas. They've allowed the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Last week, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf combined for 220 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. Probably should have been 5. OBJ's got 4.4 speed, and none of these Dallas DBs can keep up. He'll see primary coverage from Darryl Worley, and he's giving up catches at an 80% rate. And on the other side, he'll see Trayvon Diggs, who's been targeted on 40% of his routes covered, allowing 1.8 yards per route run in his coverage. I expect Beckham to be heavily involved in this contest. The Browns have gotten off to a slow start in every game this season, getting outscored 9-20 in first quarters so far. And if that happens this Sunday, OBJ should see double-digit targets. Dude's textbook boom or bust, and against this secondary, I think it's a boom. He's this week's Allen Robinson, and that makes him my favorite GPP play at wide receiver this week. Houston Texans wide receiver Will Fuller, at home against Minnesota, and Houston's a 3.5-point favorite. Fuller's priced at 5,900 on DraftKings and projected for 12.1 fantasy points. And this guy's another one of those high upside players that's hard to peg. He dropped a goose egg in week 2 and then scored a touchdown on your bench in week 3. This week, the matchup is juicy AF. He draws a Minnesota defense that allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They're giving up 299 receiving yards per game, and that's 3rd most in the NFL. Fuller lines up all across the formation, and none of these Vikings cornerbacks can cover him. Collectively, they average over 2 yards per route covered, and that has me taking a real long look at Will Fuller this week. Pro Football Focus has him projected for less than 9% ownership, so you're going to get some leverage there. I know it's hard to roster Fuller with any confidence, but I really do trust him to come through in a major way. I think a Watson-Fuller stack has legit GPP winning upside this week, and we'll find out this Sunday. There's lots of value at the position this week, so I want to quickly mention 3 other guys. Miami Dolphins Devontae Parker, at home against Seattle, priced at 5,700, projected for 14.3 fantasy points. And even though Parker is clearly playing through a hamstring injury, he's Fitzpatrick's favorite target, and the matchup is super juicy. Las Vegas Raiders Hunter Renfrow, at home against Buffalo, priced at 4,600, projected for 11.9 fantasy points. And with how thin the Raiders are at wide receiver, the volume should be there. Plus, he's got that Value City price tag. In New England Patriots, Damiere Byrd, on the road at Kansas City, priced at 3,000, projected for 8.4 fantasy points. And this is a dart throw, but this dude is an every down player for a Patriots team who's a 7-point dog. Moving on, let's dive into my top plays at tight end this week. I really like the pricing this week, but we're going to have to pick our spots wisely. I want to target a tight end who's got a value price tag and the ability to hit pay dirt. And this week, my guy's Dallas Cowboys tight end, Dalton Schultz. At home against Cleveland, Dallas is a 4.5-point favorite. DraftKings has him priced at 4,300 and projected for 8.4 fantasy points. Schultz has really stepped up since Blake Jarwin went down. He's been targeted on 21% of his routes run, and he's catching 70% of those passes. This week, he gets a Cleveland defense that allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the position. They've allowed 3 touchdowns to opposing tight ends this season, and I like that trend to continue. Schultz has the trust to quarterback Dak Prescott, and I think he'll be heavily targeted this week. Dude should be able to hit 3 times cost per point with catches and yardage alone, and if he hits pay dirt, it's money in the bank. You can lock him in. Like I said earlier, I really like the pricing at tight end this week, so I've got 2 bonus plays for you. Las Vegas Raiders Darren Waller, at home against Buffalo, priced at 5,200, projected for 14.7 fantasy points, and this should be a get-right game for the Raiders' big man. The Bills allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to the position, and his price tag is just too low to pass up. And I also like Washington tight end Logan Thomas at home against Baltimore. He's priced at $3,500, projected for 9.5 fantasy points, and I expect Washington to be behind early and throw the ball a ton. Baltimore has a good defense, but their linebacking core is suspect. I like Thomas for a handful of catches and enough yardage to get to 3 times cost per point. Let's round out the Week 4 preview with my top plays at defense and special teams. I'm expecting most of the ownership to be on the Ravens or the Rams, and for good reason. But I took a deep dive into defense this week and settled on something a little more sneaky. Tampa Bay Buccaneers. At home against the Chargers, the Bucs are a 7.5 point favorite. Priced at $3,400 and projected for 7.4 fantasy points. The Bucs defense has been much improved this season. They're super stingy against the run, allowing 70 rush yards per game and an NFL best 0.96 yards before contact. Plus, the pass rush has been impressive. They pressure quarterbacks at a 27% rate, converting 20% of those pressures for 12 total sacks. And that pressure up front has helped on the backside. The Bucs are second in the NFL with 4 interceptions. This week, they face off against a Chargers offense that ranks 12th against opposing defenses. Their strong suit is running the football, and that's just not going to work this week. We'll see how rookie quarterback Justin Herbert holds up against the pass rush. He's taken 4 sacks in 2 games and turned the ball over 3 times. The Bucs defense has been red hot over the last 2 weeks, and I think they're in a nice spot to three-peat. With some of the other defensive matchups out there, I think we're going to get some ownership leverage too, and that makes Tampa Bay my top play at defense this week. And that's a wrap on the Week 4 Draftkings Fantasy Preview. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF or over on YouTube at ManFans Fantasy Football Podcast. If you love the show, smash the like button, subscribe to the podcast, and share this episode. Good luck this week. I hope you guys see some green screens, and I'll catch you on the flip side.